For most of human history, love had almost nothing to do with marriage. Not in the way we romanticize it, not in the soft, candlelit way the word sounds when we say it now. Biological anthropologist Helen Fisher, after studying pair bonding customs across 154 documented cultures, found that romantic love as you experience it today, obsessive, electrical, consuming, was never the original point. Marriage was a labor agreement, a territorial alliance, an economic contract drawn up between families who often barely consulted the two people at the center of it. And the reason why is going to make you look at your own story about love very differently. Because somewhere between that ancient arrangement and the soulmate idea you grew up with, something enormous shifted inside the human mind. By the end of this video, the assumption that love and marriage naturally belong together is going to feel a lot less obvious than it does right now. So let's go back. All the way back. Your ancestors did not marry for love. That is not a cynical reading of history. It is the default state of almost every human society ever documented. Marriage was far too important to be entrusted to something as unstable as emotion. It bound land, it secured water rights, it wove together two extended kinship networks into a single defensive and economic unit. A marriage in the ancient world was closer to a geopolitical treaty than anything you would recognize from your own life. Anthropologist David Graeber argued that the earliest human economies were not built on markets, but on obligation. And marriage was one of the most fundamental obligations a community could forge. The union did not belong to the two people inside it. It belonged to the networks of family, tribe, resource, and memory that surrounded them. The individuals were almost incidental. But here is what nobody tells you. Love was not absent from the ancient world. It simply lived somewhere else. In ancient Greece, in Rome, in the courts of medieval Europe, romantic obsession was real, celebrated, and extensively documented. Ovid wrote entire catalogues of seduction technique. Roman aristocrats maintained elaborate love affairs with a frankness that would make most modern people uncomfortable. The 12th century troubadour tradition in southern France elevated romantic longing to the highest of all art forms, the notion that to love someone you could never fully have was the purest, most spiritually elevating experience available to a human being. But in almost every case, these passionate attachments existed outside marriage, not inside it. Love was for the affair. Marriage was for the family. They were not just separate, they were considered incompatible by design. Think about what that actually means. For most of recorded history, the idea that you should marry the person you are passionately in love with would have been considered not just naive, but irresponsible, dangerous, a direct threat to the social order that held everything together. Aristotle argued that the highest form of love, the deep, devoted, world-rearranging kind, was only possible between equals who had known each other long enough to see past desire and into character. Erotic passion he considered temporary, a species of madness, something that would inevitably cool, leaving two people stranded together if they had chosen each other for that reason alone. He was not entirely wrong about the cooling, but he could not have anticipated what would happen when an entire civilization decided to build its most foundational institution on top of it. And if what you just heard is making you reassess something, stay with me. Because what comes next is where it gets genuinely strange. Because across the ancient world, there is documented evidence of something even more radical than arranged marriage. Burial sites excavated across Eurasia. Sites spanning the Mesolithic and early Neolithic periods suggest that some prehistoric communities may have practiced what biological anthropologists now call serial pair bonding. Not one lifelong partner, not a rotating succession of lovers with no commitment. A sequence of genuine, exclusive attachments, each bounded in time, each dissolving and reforming as the conditions of survival changed around them. Helen Fisher, in her landmark study, Anatomy of Love, makes the case that the human pair bond evolved not for life, but for approximately 4 years. The number is not arbitrary. 4 years, she argues, is the minimum window for a child to move through the most dependent phase of early infancy with 2 actively present parents. Once that window closed, the evolutionary pressure to stay together dissolved. The biochemistry shifted. The attachment cooled, not because something went wrong, but because the biological purpose of the bond had been served. The implication of that is enormous. Lifelong monogamy may not be the natural state that humans evolved toward. It may be a social technology, invented, refined, and enforced by cultures that needed stable inheritance structures, created not because biology preferred it, but because property law required it. Consider what researchers have observed in the Mosuo people of southwest China, one of the few surviving matrilineal societies. Mosuo women do not marry in any conventional sense. They practice what anthropologists describe as walking marriages. A partner visits at night and returns to his own family home by morning. Children are raised communally within the mother's family. The concept of a husband, as most cultures define it, simply does not exist. And yet Mosuo communities are not chaotic. They are deeply coherent, governed by powerful social obligation, with strong and clearly legible emotional bonds between parents and children. What the Mosuo reveal is not that marriage is a mistake. It is that marriage is a choice, a deliberate architecture that different human groups assembled in different configurations for different reasons under different pressures. It was never a law of nature. It was always a negotiation with one. So when did love finally enter the marriage contract? And why? The answer is more recent than almost anyone expects. And it arrived for reasons that had almost nothing to do with romance. The shift accelerates in Western Europe around the 12th and 13th centuries. The Catholic Church launched an aggressive campaign to redefine marriage as a sacrament, and critically, one that required the free public consent of both parties. Historian Stephanie Kuntz, in her definitive account, Marriage: A History, argues that the Church's motivation was largely political. By insisting that a valid marriage required mutual consent rather than family arrangement, Rome was dismantling the machinery that noble families had used for centuries to consolidate land, titles, and power through arranged unions. The Church inserted itself as the ultimate authority over who could bind to whom. Above kinship, above class, above the will of any father. Consent is not love, but it cracked the door. The second force was industrialization, when rural families dissolved their ties to communally worked land and moved into cities where individuals earned independent wages. The economic rationale for family-arranged marriage collapsed almost immediately. For the first time in most of human history, young men and women had their own income. They could survive without their family's blessing. They could choose, and what they chose, almost universally, was the person who made them feel something. Kuntz documents that by the early 19th century, a new and genuinely radical idea had taken root across Western culture, that love should precede marriage, not follow it, not exist alongside it in a parallel life, precede it. The romantic model inverted everything the ancient world had built. Instead of learning to love someone you were paired with, you were now expected to locate someone you already loved, and then formalize the discovery. By any historical standard, this was an experiment, one of the largest social experiments ever conducted, and we are still inside it. Subscribe if you want more of this, the questions underneath the questions that nobody thought to ask. Because here is what the experiment produced that no one warned the participants about. Historian Edward Shorter, in his foundational work, The Making of the Modern Family, traced how, as romantic love became the primary justification for marriage, divorce rates began their long and unbroken climb, not because people became worse at love, but because the bar for what a marriage needed to deliver became impossibly high. When marriage was an economic alliance, a workable partnership was success. When marriage became a romantic ideal, anything less than continuous emotional fulfillment began to feel like failure. The same institution, completely different expectations, and the gap between what marriage was built to do and what it was now being asked to do grew into something millions of people fall through every single year, convinced they chose the wrong person, when in fact they may simply have inherited the wrong model. Think about the word soulmate. It implies a singular perfect match, one person hidden somewhere in the world whose presence completes something broken in you. Your ancestors had no equivalent word for this concept. They could not have had one. The idea would have been incomprehensible. They did not search for someone to complete them. They searched for someone hardworking, reliable, resourceful, and well-connected to the right networks. The heart was consulted last, if at all. And yet something strange appears when you study the oldest burial evidence available to us. Across sites in Europe, the Levant, and Central Asia, archaeologists have found pairs interred together, sometimes a man and a woman, sometimes apparent same-sex companions, positioned facing each other across millennia of dark and silence, sometimes with personal grave goods arranged as if one person's most treasured items were being offered to the other, for a journey the living could not follow. Researchers, including archaeologist April Nowell, have argued that these arrangements suggest emotional bonds that exceed economic utility. That grief, the specific, disorienting, private grief of losing someone whose absence reshapes the shape of every ordinary day, may be ancient beyond reckoning, far older than any institution ever built to contain it. Which means the capacity for love is not something modernity invented. It is something modernity tried to organize. And there is a difference. You did not invent the longing you carry. That is ancient, pre-linguistic. It predates every word you have ever used to describe it, every ceremony ever held to mark it, every law ever written to define and protect it. What the last 2 centuries invented, or more precisely, what they demanded, is that one legal institution should be the permanent home of that longing for the entire duration of a human life, with one chosen and singular person. Your ancestors would have found that idea breathtaking, not romantic, breathtaking, in precisely the way a cliff edge is breathtaking, exhilarating and vertiginous, and potentially fatal. The ancient model of marriage was not more cynical than ours. It was more honest about what an institution can hold and what only human beings, freely, daily, without guarantee, can choose to give each other. So tonight, if you are beside someone or looking for someone or sitting somewhere in the uncertain middle, consider the possibility that what you feel is not a problem to be solved by finding the right arrangement. It is the oldest thing you carry in your body. It has outlasted every version of the institution that has ever tried to contain it, channel it, or declare when it should begin and end, just as it did the first time in the dark of some ancient burial ground, when 2 people were placed facing each other with no word for what they were, and no institution to name what they had. Only the evidence still there in the earth that they mattered to someone, that someone stayed,